Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Now, in a major about turn in US foreign policy, it has been decided that sanctions would be imposed on Russia following a brief concept of a meeting between Trump and Putin, which ultimately will not take place, at least for now. Nevertheless, the sanctions imposed on the Russian oil sector remain to be seen when it comes to their efficiency. The big question remains, will they work? And what will other countries do? Will they actually play along? Now, joining us now to discuss this is Hugo Dixon, commentator at large at Reuters. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Lovely to be with you again.
So let's talk about the decision itself and also what brought it about. Do you think that Putin proved to be the ultimate time waster and that even Trump knows that it doesn't really make sense to actually talk to him because in the end what is going to be agreed will be nullified further down the line?
I think that Trump's position can flip-flop very easily. So 1 week he can be in favor of talking to Putin. The next week he can be in favor of putting pressure on Putin. And then the week after he could flip back again and want to see Putin in a summit. So I don't see this as necessarily a stable US position. In terms of why Trump has done this, I think that part of the reason is probably because of what he considers to be his success in Gaza. Obviously, a lot remains to be done there, but he feels he's on a roll and that what he managed to do in Gaza was by putting pressure on both sides, he got at least the first stage of a deal. Putin wasn't playing ball. He wouldn't give any ground from his previous position. And so what we see is Trump putting more pressure on him. Of course, he also tried to put a lot of pressure on Ukraine. But Zelensky said, no, we're not going to give up more land in order to get a ceasefire with Putin. So this is why I think he's moved in that direction. The other thing, which is a little bit speculative on my behalf, but I think that because Steve Witkoff, who was Trump's main envoy to Russia, has now been fully occupied with trying to push forward the Gaza peace plan, he hasn't been able to focus that much on Russia. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has been much more involved in that discussion. It was he who then spoke to Lavrov a few days ago. And Rubio is much more like a classic Republican securocrat from an American perspective. In other words, he doesn't trust Russia, whereas Witkoff was more willing to trust Russia. So I think those are perhaps some of the factors that would go into explaining Trump's sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, which are quite significant.
Some of our viewers might actually remember Trump's comments about how Witkoff went in to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, and he seemed to suggest that Witkoff didn't really know that much about Putin or Russia. He just went in and just stayed in the room for a couple of hours, to the extent that Trump was surprised that he's still in there. But now, coming back to the sanctions, you said that they are substantial. How much damage could they do to the Russian economy at the present stage?
Well, I think we're already seeing not formal announcements, but well-sourced stories that India is going to sharply cut back on its purchases of Russian oil. And so that's their, after China, the second biggest purchaser of Russian oil. There is also some signs that the Chinese, some state-owned Chinese companies will cut back on purchases of Russian oil. I think that will only be temporary. I think that China will find some workaround, but I think India is likely to be more sustainable. And then there is, of course, the other main purchaser of Russian oil is Turkey. I think it's likely that Turkey will also fall into line because these American sanctions are not just sanctions against those companies, they're what's called secondary sanctions. And so they bring the full weight of American financial and economic and legal power against anybody who deals, or any company that deals with either Lukoil or Rosneft or any of their subsidiaries. So I think that Turkey will probably come into line. And then, of course, there is the question, they're still in Europe, particularly Hungary is buying Russian oil. And so I think that will hasten the end of European Union purchases of Russian oil. Of course, we also saw the European Union's own sanctions package, 19th sanction package this week, which includes an acceleration in the cut of purchases of Russian gas, particularly liquefied natural gas. And that's not as important nearly as the American sanctions, but that is another useful squeeze on Russia's hydrocarbon revenue. However, what I would add is that the oil price has gone up. And so while it's probably likely that Russia will sell less crude oil and refined products outside in Russia, it may be able to maintain a reasonably good price for them. Now, the oil price hasn't gone up a lot. It's only about 5%. But if there really are significant cutbacks in purchases of Russian oil, I would expect that oil price to go even higher unless, and this is a really important thing, unless other suppliers, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, increase their production of oil. And so I very much hope that Donald Trump will be using his good relations with these kingdoms to get them to pump more oil to replace the Russian oil that would be taken out of the market. And if you can do that, then I think that the hit on Russia will be significant, because they would get lower volumes of production and the same or possibly even lower prices. And in fact, what I would be hoping that Trump would do if he is really serious is to join the EU and the UK in cutting the maximum price at which Russian oil can be sold on the market, which the G7, the Group of Seven's price cap is now $60 a barrel. It should be possible to cut it to $45 a barrel. And if you did all of that, you could probably halve Russia's oil revenue. We're not there yet, but this is an important step in that direction. But it does need the Arab Gulf countries also to pump more oil.
And also we need to factor in the damage taken by the Russian oil sector due to the intensifying attacks by Ukrainians who are using drones and are about to also employ missiles to inflict more damage on the Russian oil sector. Now, would you say that Russia's response, namely, and I quote, that was Vladimir Putin speaking, that the sanctions will not significantly affect our economic well-being, does it mean that in truth, they are quite concerned?
I think they are concerned. And but of course, Vladimir Putin hopes that he'll be able to persuade Trump to have another meeting with him. And every time he talks to Trump, he seems to win him round to his position. And this is why it's extremely difficult to be sure that America has actually embarked on a stable new policy of squeezing Putin. However, I think that when you look at the Russian economy, it was even before these sanctions, the IMF was predicting virtually no growth this year, and inflation remains high. Interest rates are high. So despite slow growth, what we have an overheating economy, and there's a budget deficit. The budget, which is, of course, most countries do have budget deficits, but up until now, Russia hasn't had a budget deficit. It can't borrow money from abroad. It's a big chunk of its sovereign assets have been frozen in the West. That's over 300 billion. If we have time, we might want to touch on what happened at the European Council yesterday, where there was a plan to channel those assets to Ukraine, and that hasn't happened yet. But still, Russia is starting to face financial difficulties even before this new round of sanctions. So I think, and one of the ways that they have been funding themselves is through off-balance sheet mechanisms. That's more or less using the private banks to lend money to favored companies and also to some households. And that has not shown up in the government's finances for now, but it is storing up trouble in the banks because the banks are sitting on bigger bad debts. And ultimately, it's probably likely that they'll need to have a recapitalization. And the Russian government will have to find the money. And so that's another risk that Putin faces. So I think that if Trump can follow through really with these sanctions and stick to them for a long period of time, then I think we could be looking at a significant, between significant and severe financial and economic pressure on Putin.
So you've mentioned frozen Russian assets, and indeed there also has been an initiative in the US Congress a while ago to use these assets for the purposes of supporting Ukraine. Now, most of these assets are still in the European Union, specifically in Belgium. So are we really seeing a light at the end of the tunnel here? Because negotiations seem to be moving in a certain direction. Do you think there is a risk that some sort of last-minute change will derail this once again? Or could we be looking at a solid support for Ukraine, funded, ironically enough, by the Russian sovereign money?
Well, I do think that the Russian assets are an important negotiating ploy and also source of money for Ukraine. And as you say, the vast majority of them are in the European Union, with other substantial sums in Japan and the United Kingdom. Only about $5 billion is in America. There are about 210 billion euros inside the European Union. Now, what happened yesterday at the European Council is that the Belgians said, we're not prepared to go along with the precise mechanism that you have proposed, which is not confiscation of these assets. It's what we call a reparations loan. This is an idea that I devised a year and a half ago with some colleagues. So that idea hasn't gone forward yet, but I think it's still likely to happen. The leaders are going to look at it again at their next meeting, which is probably in December. And it's really by a process of elimination, because what are the alternatives? America is not providing funds to Ukraine. Either the Europeans are going to have to find more money from their own national budgets, or they have to see Ukraine being defeated by Russia because of lack of money. And that will be terrible for the EU. So I think by a process of elimination, they are likely to come forward with some mechanism that persuades the Belgians to come on board.
Hugo Dixon was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.